Greetings, viewers, and welcome to today's info sharing snippet. We'll be covering the asset transactions which can take place within the Evaluation fixed assets module. Now, there are a couple of transactions that can be processed on your fixed assets, and we're covering the various transactions and how they will be processed. So firstly, under my fixed assets maintenance, I'm going to go through to transactions and asset transactions. And you'll see that there's a range of transactions that can be processed for individual fixed assets. So firstly, we have our revaluation. So revaluation simply means that an asset has got a certain value, and due to certain modifications to the asset has now increased in value. So really it's a case of specifying the asset and selecting on revaluations. And at this particular point, we've got details about the asset, purchase price, number of units, etc., and the purchase date. And now we need to specify at which particular date is this revaluation applicable. So I'm going to specify my date where the revaluation transaction is going to be taking place. Give it a reference. And then the new value of the asset. So in this instance, I'm going to increase the value and complete the transaction. Now, what's very important here is that the correct date is specified for the revaluation transaction, simply because from that particular date, the system will then need to calculate depreciation based on the new revaluation value. So I'm going to update the transaction. And if we then revert back to our individual asset, we can see the impact of the revaluation. So I'm going to edit the asset, and you'll see we've got details about the revaluation date, and we've now got details of the new revaluation value, which will be used to calculate depreciation in the subsequent month. The next option we have is a residual revaluation. And I'm just going to go into an asset that's going to be, that we're going to amend the residual revaluation for. And if we then go to our book depreciation tab, we'll see that we've got a residual value there. And I'm now going to amend this particular value. So once again, I'm going to revert back to my fixed assets transactions and locate the asset, go to my residual revaluation, specify the date when the transaction is was going to be taking place, and insert a reference value, insert a reference there. And specify the new residual value. So currently now I'm just going to make it, for example, 10. And I'm going to update the transaction. If I revert back to my asset, edit the asset, book depreciation tab, and you'll see now that I've got my new residual revaluation there, and the asset will then depreciate until it reaches this particular residual revaluation or residual value on the particular asset. The next option we have is an asset impairment. Now, an asset impairment really is the opposite of a revaluation. The impairment occurs when you are reducing the value of the asset for a specific reason. And if I go to my asset, I'm going to go to impairment and specify the date when the impairment transaction is going to take place. And specify revaluation method. and I'm going to pick up the details or specify my impairment cost. I'm going to insert a cost of 2,300, and I'm going to process the transaction. Now, if I revert back to my fixed assets reports, we then have our asset impairments report. And I'm just going to go view those details and preview the report. And there we have details of the impairment. So I've got my purchase price. I've got my impairment information. If it was prior years, that would obviously be applicable if it was a prior year impairment. And now I've got details of the depreciation calculation after the impairment transaction has been taken into consideration. But we then have the ability to process an asset transfer. So if I go to my asset transactions and I select the transfer option, we can either do a transfer between asset types, between cost centers, between locations, and also very importantly, once again, specify the date from when the asset transfer is going to take place. And in this particular example, I'm going to change the location of the asset. So currently this is the asset's location. I'm now going to go move it to the administration building, and I'm going to process the transaction. If I then access the asset which was transferred, we then have details of the transfer and the details of the transfer date of the particular asset. We then have the ability to process the selling or scrapping of an asset. So we can then make use of the sell scrap option, and we can specify if it's a selling or scrapping of the asset, and specifying the or the selling or scrapping date. And then the details of the selling value or the scrapping value. So I'm going to say, for example, it was sold for, and the reason for the selling or scrapping of the asset. Now, very importantly is just remember is that the asset will depreciate in the month that it was sold or scrapped. So just be aware that even if the asset, for example, if the sale took place on the 1st of the particular month, the asset will still calculate depreciation for the month in which it was sold or scrapped. So I'm going to process the transaction now on specified my month. It's a selling transaction. And I'm going to say, okay. And once again, just a confirmation that I'm going to be selling or scrapping the asset. And the transaction has been completed. Now, if you are, for example, integrating into a Pastel Partner database or an Evaluation accounting database, you will be able to process a journal transaction to cater for the selling or scrapping of the asset with regards of if there was a profit or sale or profit or loss on the selling or scrapping of that asset. If I then just go back to my asset and we can check the details that have been added onto the asset based on the selling or scrapping and edit the asset, we've then got details of the selling or scrapping date, and we've then got details of the selling price, selling date, etc. of the asset. So once a selling or scrapping is taking place, those details are then added onto the individual asset record. We then have a transaction which is specifically to units of usage. So if I, for example, go to my units of usage asset, and as you can see, in this particular instance, the asset type has been set up to be units of usage. I'm going to click on the units usage option, and now I'm going to be able to specify the actual number of units consumed of that asset for a specific period. So it gives me details about the purchase price of the asset, as well as the capacity of the asset based on number of units. And now I'm simply going to go and specify the number of units that were used of that asset for a specific period. So I'm going to specify my details and the number of units. So in this instance, for example, 1,000 units were consumed of the asset, and then which options were applicable. So I can say both options, and I'm then going to process the transaction. If I then revert to my reports, and I'm going to go look at the book depreciation report for the period, I'm just going to go for the period where I specified the assets that were used or the units that were used, preview the transaction, and as you can see, the depreciation has been calculated based on the number of units that were used for that asset for the period. What would normally be the case is that you would then go, as the units are used, you would then revert back to your transactions and then go specify the number of units used in the following month. So I'm going to go to the following month and say, for example, and let's say, for example, there were 400 units used in this particular month. What you notice is that we have got a log of exactly, for example, the number of units used. So it does record those units on the specific asset. And in this instance, I specify that 400 units were used. I'm going to complete the transaction. And if I revert back to my reports, I'm going to go rerun the book depreciation report for the next month. And you'll see that we've now got the depreciation being calculated based on the number of units used for that particular period. We then have the ability to process partial disposals. So partial disposals are only applicable to assets whereby the number of units is more than one. Right, so I've got an asset there where consisting of 4 units, and I'm now going to go do process a partial disposal. So a portion of those assets are going to, or the number are going to be disposed of, and specifying the date when the partial disposal took place. And in this instance, I'm specifying the number of units which was sold or scrapped. So consisting of 4 units, we can say, for example, that 3 units were disposed of. And now we need to specify the number of units based upon the disposed units and original units. So we now need to specify a new asset code. And link it to the original asset. And then now we specify details of the remaining unit, which was initially forming part of the 4, which we initially had. And pick up original asset information. And we can now complete the transaction. So initially we had 4 units of the asset. We disposed of 3, and we've now got details about the 2 new assets, which were going to be the disposed units together with original assets. And if I say OK to that option, and I'm going to revert back to my asset register, and what you notice is that we've got the original asset there consisting of our 4 units. It was partially disposed of, and there's our partial disposal date. We then have our next asset, whereby consisting of the 3 units which were sold or scrapped, and we've got details about selling or scrapping together with the information. And finally, we've got the asset, which is a remaining asset consisting of 1 unit, and that asset was then divided, and that is the unit that is remaining out of the 4 which we originally had. And there's our new asset information. We then also have the ability to process or divide an asset. So if I go to my asset, I can use the divide option. Divide is very similar to a partial disposal. However, in this instance, we can specify a percentage of the asset which was divided. I'm going to specify the date which the transaction took place. The percentage. So I'm going to say, for example, maybe say 20% of the asset was divided. And now, once again, I need to specify the new asset code. So I'm going to say, for example, and specify the original asset which was divided. And then this is the 80%, and then specify those details. Original asset, and I'm going to complete the transaction. So with regards to the division, we're now specifying a percentage which was divided. And to complete the transaction, if I then revert to my assets, you see that we've now got the asset there, and edit the asset. We've now got the 20%, which was 20% of the initial purchase price, which was 20%. And then we've got our second asset there, which is now forming the 80% of the original asset. So, and we've got the division information there of the asset, division date, etc. So, as you can see, there's a variety of transactions that can be undertaken on your fixed assets. And then these include the revaluation, being an increase in the value of an asset, the residual revaluation, being amending the residual value of the asset, impairment, being reducing the value of the asset. A transfer allows you to transfer assets between cost centers, locations, as well as asset types. The ability to sell or scrap an asset. The ability to partially dispose of an asset, which is applicable if an asset consists of more than one unit. The dividing of an asset, which allows you to divide an asset based on certain percentages. And then units of usage, whereby if you are using an asset and you want to depreciate the number of units consumed, you would need to then go and specify the number of units that were used for a specific period, and the depreciation would be calculated based on the number of units used, based on the total number of units available for that asset. I do hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for watching. It's over and out for me, and goodbye.